The paper actually is a book appendix. And it's a book appendix that is a long exercise in robustness. So the book is about deliberating monetary policy. And what we seek to do, and this has been a many-year project, is to look at committee deliberations in the U.S., in both the House and Senate banking committees over about a 33-year period as they conduct oversight on U.S. monetary policy. And they do so in a formal context in the space of two oversight meetings per year. And these are where the chairman of the Federal Reserve, currently Ben Bernanke, comes to testify before Congress. We look essentially at deliberation as best we can assess deliberation in those meetings. We also look at another institution, and that is the Federal Reserve. In the Federal Reserve, like all central banks, we have a committee that is a policy-making committee that actually deliberates and sets the actual interest rate. Those meetings are not televised, but they do set policy. The transcripts are available after a 5-year period, but the congressional committee hearings are on television, highly publicized, and indeed a media circus. Okay, so we look at those across institutions over time and essentially look at the extent to which we can assess deliberation, quality of deliberation, and so on. So what we have is congressional hearings, thank you, over about a 33-year period. So we've got Burns, Volcker, Burns, Miller, Volcker, Greenspan, Bernanke, in both the congressional or the House Financial Services and the Senate Banking Committee. So just to recap, we've got the Senate and the House oversight hearings. We also look at the Senate reconfirmation hearings of the chairman. I won't go into that, and then of the policy-making body itself. All right, and just to give you the context, we do this over a period of the mid-1970s to 2010, and it's a period in monetary policy which is quite an important period. We go from the mid-1970s, early 1980s, of a period of stagflation, high unemployment, a lot of angst felt by central bankers and politicians because essentially they were delivering a very poor monetary policy outcome, the success of the Greenspan years, i.e. in delivering stable low inflation. So that's sort of the context. Now, the book is about that. It also uses, in order as a form of validation, and you might want to call it external validation, we use elite interviews to check, in part, the results that we obtain. So a couple of dozen interviews of former Fed officials who sat on the FOMC and also members of Congress and congressional staff. Right. That's fine as part of the integral part of the book itself. That's one form of validation. So this long appendix is a different form of validation, sort of an internal robustness check. So this Alcest is the toolkit that we use, the software that we use. The problem with Alcest is that it's proprietary software. So we don't really know entirely what is going on in the black box. When it works extremely well, but we do have this problem with validation. So the two subsequent software, TLAB and DTM-BIC. Now I just want to give you a flavor for the software. All three software seek to do essentially the same thing. They're thematic approaches to automated content analysis. By that I mean that all three software try to capture the meaning of the text within the context, so not just the bag of words, but the co-occurrence, and within paragraph format so that you can interpret not just the words themselves, but how they were relayed, and the surrounding context for the argument, such as it is. Now that's quite a bit different, and I'll use Daniel's. Daniel's co-author on one of the other papers, and he last week actually had to give a nice comparison between a thematic-based approach to automated content analysis and a topic model. He says, okay, pretend you have on this table a bunch of recipes, and they are of different nationalities. So you might have Italian and Chinese and Thai and whatever, right? And you want to sort them. So you might have a model that looks at the list of ingredients. So you might have ingredients that have basil and garlic and spaghetti and tomato sauce. And you think, okay, we'll stack those together and we'll probably call them Italian recipes, okay? And you might have a different stack of soy sauce and bean sprouts and rice and whatever. We might call those Chinese recipes, right? So we have a sorting exercise going on. Now that's quite a bit different. That would be a topic model. We don't need the full list of ingredients. We have just enough to sort the whole of the recipes. A thematic exercise is quite a bit different. So here, imagine that we have on the table a series of restaurant reviews. And we are seeking to set up a new restaurant. And we want to kind of think about what are the reviewers thinking about. So you might have context talking about the ambiance and the proximity to the street, the noise level, the lighting, so on and so on. And you might say, okay, that has to do with sort of the atmosphere of the restaurant. Then you might have something about, the waiter was very friendly and we got our meal quickly. And okay, so something about service. So you might have different substantive themes. Now that's the kind of thing that these models seek to do. All right. So the basic story from the book is that we have in Congress, members of Congress talking about one set of topics, for the most part, politically motivated topics, and we have the Federal Reserve talking about the guts of monetary policy. They're talking cross purposes. That's the bottom line for the book. And the same thing happens, but even a cleaner divide between the Fed chair and Congress. So the basic story that we have from the book is members of Congress essentially don't engage much in oversight. Okay, they're talking at cross purposes. In terms of institutional differences, not really much. A little bit, but not much. They're both senators and representatives are both sidetracked by fiscal policy measures, by talking about energy policy, education policy, and not really much about the real economy. And thirdly, an over time change in how they conceptualize inflation in the economy. Is inflation the product of too much money, i.e., is it about the money supply, or is it more about people's behavior and how we expect people to behave in response to certain conditions? So that sort of changes over time. So the first cut into it, and it's a pretty simple cut, and we're using the TLAB as a check first, is such as we can capture these different themes, do we find essentially the same themes when we use a different methodological toolkit? If we don't, well, then we're going to kind of worry about the first toolkit. If we do, then we have some degree of confidence. So what do we find? Well, so here we have the results from Alcest. This is in the House, from TLAB in House, Senate, Alcest, and TLAB in the Senate. I don't know how well you can read that, but basically in boldface, we've got 6 thematic groupings that we can actually map up quite well across both the results from Alcest and from TLAB. There are some little differences when we get into capturing how both the Fed chair and the members of Congress talk about the challenges facing monetary policy, about uncertainty and understanding the data. But for the most part, we actually find a fair amount of marrying up of the data, which is reassuring. What we don't find in terms of parallel between the packages And this, I think, is a larger issue in trying to capture systematically complex arguments. When, for instance, members of Congress are diverting the Fed chair to talk about non-monetary policy issues. So, Chairman Greenspan, what do you think about the administration's stance on education? Or Chairman Greenspan, don't you think we ought to be pushing through policies on Social Security? Right. Those sort of issues ALSES seems to capture well, but it doesn't come through in the other package. Or when you have more complex linkages between sort of capital inflows, current account deficit, exchange rates, seems to be captured by ALSES, but not by TLAB. Now, is that right or is it wrong? Is that a criticism of ALSES? Is it, I can't read that.
We're at 12.
I'm at 12.
We'll leave until 60.
Okay. So the question here is, there remains a challenge in trying to capture systematically arguments where the speaker is grabbing at different concepts, linking them together in unique ways. So anyway, I just flagged that as an issue. There's no right or wrong necessarily. I'm going to skip through. These are the dendrograms from TLAB. What we do find, once again, in terms of categorizing the speakers, and this is the Federal Reserve Chairman, these are the members of the committee, is that for the most part, we find the same story. Members of the committee are talking about fiscal policy for the most part. The Fed Chairman, for the most part, is talking about inflation in prices, and that goes through the story quite systematically in the Senate as well. I'm going to skip over the party affiliation. The overtime, here's the overtime story, and it gets us to the DTM VIC software. Let me skip this a little bit. We do have a nice overtime story that the software captures perhaps a bit more elegantly than ALSES. In other words, we've got the years here, and this is for the House, and we have essentially 6 different classes, and they're numbered, and they're essentially in sequential order. So we have, in the early period, this is the 1970s, a lot of talk about monetary aggregates, labor market, the inflation, talking about inflation, obviously how to deal with the inflationary dragon, and moves down to sort of vocal revolution. That's another story, but essentially it's the first real serious cut into the Fed trying to tackle inflation. Move down to fiscal policy, and what we see then more clearly is a move up, sort of if you draw a line here, is a difference in how the committee sought to understand monetary policy, more in terms of inflation as a product of the money supply. So let's talk about monetary aggregates, as opposed to sort of the US economy, real economy. And then, of course, we've got a very clear divide up in this corner in the early stages, 06, 07, and then very distinct in 08 with the financial crisis. We do have an overtime picture. And if we take just a sample of the years in the words, it becomes out reasonably clear. I'm not going to go through the words. You're going to have to take my word for it. But you have a story of, once again, moving from a discourse on inflation and interest rates to one talking about sort of real economy and dragging the Fed chairman into other issues of Social Security and jobs, and then ultimately a whole new era with the financial regulation and the financial crisis. The bottom line, then, here's the punchline, is, okay, so we've got essentially multiple checks on the same data. So are there robust, do we find a story of robustness? Well, before we get to that, second question, and I kind of had this as perhaps it was a mistaken hope, is by using new software, do we learn anything more? Well, not really, I thought. A lot of effort for not a lot more knowledge. Now maybe that's not a bad thing. It depends what you're after. So if the reward is you want to have new insights, new information, well, it's not a very fruitful exercise. If, however, your reward is greater certainty, well, then yes, probably it is worth the effort.